Today we're about to embark on a journey that takes us deep into the world of gluten intolerance. We're going to uncover some surprising truths and debunk some myths. Also, we're going to be exploring some groundbreaking tests that are changing the way that we understand our health. From the bread on your table to the coffee in your mug, get ready because you're going to see these things in a whole new light. Welcome to the Hashimoto's Doctor Podcast. You're now part of a growing community of people determined to take their health back through education and self-empowerment. But because of the healthcare system today, we don't have access to the types of healthcare that we want. So we have to do things differently. We've got to do things smarter, and we do that by becoming our own advocates. This podcast will give you the perspective and thoughts of one of the world's leading Hashimoto's doctors. So let's get started. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Hashimoto's Doctor Podcast. I'm your host, Brad Shook, and in today's episode, we're going to dive into the interesting and surprisingly intricate and complicated world of gluten intolerance. We're going to explore gluten intolerance's far-reaching effects, some of the science behind it, and a few innovative tests that are offering us new insights into your unique immunological response to gluten that you may be completely unaware of. So whether you're a longtime listener or just joining us for the first time, this episode promises to be a really interesting and enlightening one, at least I hope. So let's dive in. Gluten is a term that we hear pretty often, especially with the rise of gluten-free diets. Gluten and gluten-free diets are things that you hear in popular culture, on TV shows. I mean, it's far more common than it used to be. But there are some interesting things and nuances to this that a lot of people don't realize. And it can actually be creating some very significant health problems, especially if you're someone that has an autoimmune condition like Hashimoto's or really any autoimmune condition. But what exactly is gluten? Well, first of all, it's important to understand that gluten is a complex protein, and it's found primarily in wheat, barley, and rye. And a lot of people, when they hear about gluten, it's associated with the idea that it can trigger celiac disease, which is a really severe and very significant inflammatory bowel disease that destroys the lining of the small intestine and creates major health problems. And that in and of itself is a very serious problem. But there are some other things that occur and that gluten can do that are very significant. Its consequences are actually far more extensive and can affect other systems and tissues throughout the body. One of the things that I found very interesting was that gluten has been linked to over 55 different diseases, and most of these are autoimmune diseases where the immune system attacks the body. And here's something that actually might surprise you. Its effects aren't just limited to the digestive tract, which we talked about with celiac disease, which is an inflammatory bowel disease. It's actually connected to neurological symptoms and even to issues with your skin. And this is really just pretty amazing when you think about this. I mean, what can't gluten have a negative impact on? And this is just really a testament to the fact that our bodies are so interconnected, and what affects one part can also have ripple effects elsewhere. Let's delve a bit deeper into the world of gluten. While gluten is a term that we often use, it's really a bit of an oversimplification because wheat alone contains numerous components that can trigger immune reactions. And then there's this concept of cross-reactivity, and this is where things get really interesting and is really, quite frankly, pretty controversial. But I hope that I can do it justice based on the research that's available and then also how this idea of cross-reactivity has been debated. But it is still very relevant to anyone dealing with an autoimmune disease and potentially with a reaction, even if it's a non-celiac gluten sensitivity or celiac disease. I think that understanding and discussing cross-reactivity is very important. So the concept of cross-reactivity is what occurs when our body's immune system gets confused. I mean, to keep it simple, you can just basically say confused. And this is where the immune system may actually mistake other foods like dairy or even instant coffee. And really, it's not the coffee, it's instant coffee was shown in some scientific literature to be potentially a problem for people that are on a gluten-free diet because it is often contaminated. And what you'll find out is a lot of the foods that are discussed as and that have been commented on in social media and online as gluten cross-reactive foods, basically meaning that your immune system could react to those foods as if they were gluten, is maybe a bit of an oversimplification or a misstatement to a degree, because really what it comes down to is that a lot of the foods that are labeled as gluten cross-reactive are actually just extremely commonly contaminated with gluten. So this is an important differentiation, but there's also, which I'll talk about in a second, there's also real value to looking at and being more critical of some of the foods that are held out as being gluten cross-reactive. We'll talk about that in a second. But it's basically the immune system, this idea of cross-reactivity is where, to keep it, use an analogy, it's kind of like mistaking, let's say, a zebra for a horse because they both have 4 legs and a mane. It's really why some people, this concept and this problem is why some people, despite being on a gluten-free diet, they still experience symptoms, and it's as if their body is still reacting to these foods as if they're gluten. And again, in most cases, these gluten cross-reactive foods are just simply contaminated with gluten. So let's talk about that. Before we talk about the gluten-associated cross-reactive foods, the first thing that I'd like to do is just make sure that we're on the same page when we're talking about the way that the body can react to gluten. So first we talked about celiac disease, then we talked about non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and then third, there's a wheat allergy. So let me just make sure that we're on the same page here. So celiac disease is genetic. You have to have genes to develop celiac disease. It's autoimmune, and then it occurs in reaction to the ingestion of gluten. So it has to be inherited, the predisposition to developing it. The person has to be consuming gluten, and the disease has to be activated. Okay, so that's really important to understand. Now, there's a lot of different things that are speculated to be triggers, just like with any autoimmune condition, but this is what has to be in place for celiac disease to be developed. And then it can be determined through various blood tests, genetic testing, and then a biopsy of the small intestine. Okay, so that's celiac disease. The second thing, I want to make sure we're on the same page, is non-celiac gluten sensitivity, also abbreviated as NCGS. And this is also referred to, you'll see people say gluten sensitivity. This is what they mean. Or non-celiac wheat sensitivity, which is also sometimes the way it's written. So there are a lot of different ways that this can be referred to, and it's not particularly well defined. It's not a true allergy. And when we see true allergies, you can test in the blood for immunoglobulin E, so IgE reactions to things. And this is something that you're probably familiar with if you've ever done like an environmental allergen test or, an allergy test at your primary care conventional medical doctor. They're typically going to do a panel that looks at IgE, which is immunoglobulin E responses, which are true allergies. Now, interestingly enough, non-celiac gluten sensitivity is not that. What I'm going to talk about in a second, which I haven't really mentioned, but it's worth mentioning, is a wheat allergy, which is a true IgE response. And it's not to the gluten. It's actually to maybe some of the other, hundreds of proteins found in wheat itself. But when someone that has a wheat allergy eats other gluten-containing grains, they don't have that response. So it's not the gluten in those cases. It's a wheat allergy, in that particular situation. But the non-celiac gluten sensitivity, again, is the one that's more difficult to define. It is complicated because it's not perfectly, well understood. There's suspicion that it could be due to like an innate immune response, and our immune system's really complicated. But we have one branch of our immune system that has this ability to react to things immediately, and that's the innate immune system. And there's a belief that part of some people with non-celiac gluten sensitivity may have this innate immune response. And then they could also have an immune response to any of the other proteins, but it's not an IgE response. So it's not that anaphylactic true allergy response. And this is where the Cyrex Laboratories Array 3X, it's a test that I really like. And I like it because they look at 23 different ways that your immune system can react to wheat. And it also, it doesn't just cover the proteins. It covers the lectin portion, plus it covers transglutaminase 2, 3, and 6, which are found in the intestinal lining, the skin, and the brain. And this can give you an idea of whether or not there's an immune response to these, what you would call like extra-intestinal, so outside of the intestine tissues, and if gluten could be affecting you there. And this is a really significant and important test. I think that this really should be the standard when we're doing that initial workup to see how someone may be reacting to wheat. And because quite frankly, the other tests that are done conventionally, the conventional test with just looking at alpha-gliadin, which is one portion of the gluten protein, and then just looking at transglutaminase 2, which is in the intestine, those are really, outdated. They're not as thorough as could be for an initial screening. So with the Cyrex Array 3X, if I see reactivity there, if I see immunological reactivity, then that is really one of my top suspicions. It shows us that the immune system, that non-celiac gluten sensitivity is occurring. And then if celiac disease hasn't been ruled out, then you have to keep that in mind as well. So there are 3 different things that I want to make sure we're on the same page with here. So celiac disease, non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and then wheat allergy. Those are 3 different things I want to make sure that we're, all in the same place before we move forward and start discussing this gluten cross-reactive foods list and some of the nuances there. So the next thing let's just go ahead and talk about this gluten-associated cross-reactive foods panel. Okay, so now let's talk about the gluten cross-reactive foods. Now, this is a panel that was put together by Aristo Vojdani at Cyrex Laboratories. And this is a great panel. People have criticized it, but in my opinion, it is a fantastic panel. I've used it clinically many times, and it has been valuable in helping us to determine foods that the person is sensitive to, that they're having a quantifiable, objective immune response against, so that we can look at those foods and we can specifically remove those from the diet and then observe the person's response using quantitative data rather than just doing, a full-on elimination of every food, which we still do that in a lot of cases. We do an elimination diet and then do a reintroduction. But the quantitative assessment of foods that someone is reacting to, in my clinical experience, has been very helpful. So this particular test is called Cyrex Labs Array 4. It's the gluten-associated cross-reactive foods and food sensitivities. Now, this test looks at a lot of the foods that someone may consume when they go on a gluten-free diet. That's one thing. And then it looks at foods that are very commonly contaminated with wheat. And this is all important as well. So a lot of times when people go on gluten-free diets, they just look for like whatever says gluten-free. If anything says gluten-free, they go for it. Or if they look up online that there's a particular, grain that's a non-gluten containing grain, then they purchase that grain and then they replace their wheat with that or their gluten containing grains with that in cooking or, in their meals. So this is an important test because it looks at a lot of these commonly introduced foods that either may react in the body similarly to gluten, or that are found to commonly create immune responses in people that also have immune responses against gluten. Or third, these foods also have a real high probability of being cross-contaminated with gluten. So this test, in my opinion, again, has been very valuable clinically. I've seen it work and be very insightful and very helpful. So I think that this is a great test to consider. Now, the idea of a gluten cross-reactive food is that at the most pure level is that the food itself, or the protein in the food itself, that the immune system may not be able to differentiate or tell apart the food. Like, let's say, for example, casein in cow's milk, and that the immune system may not be able to differentiate or tell the difference between casein and gluten. And then therefore the idea is that if you consumed the dairy product with casein, and if it made its way into your bloodstream, the immune system may think that the casein is gluten and drive the same kind of immune response throughout the body. That's the general idea behind the gluten cross-reactive foods themselves. And I think this is where there's been a lot of debate amongst researchers as to whether or not this occurs and to what degree this occurs. And all I can tell you with certainty is that this particular test looks at gluten-contaminated foods and foods that are commonly replaced on a gluten-free diet, and because of that, it has been extremely valuable. Regardless of whether or not the cross-reactions are occurring to these foods in the way that some people have represented them. And I'm sure that I have misrepresented in how I spoke about it in the past, but my knowledge and understanding about this topic now is that, yes, there's debate amongst the researchers as to what is actually happening. Is the immune system actually reacting to certain proteins as if it's gluten, or are we seeing that these commonly newly introduced or overconsumed foods on a gluten-free diet are actually are actually causing an immune response themselves, independent of gluten. So you remove one thing like gluten that is creating an immune response and potentially causing a problem, and then you reintroduce something like, let's just say, tapioca. You start buying all these tapioca-based pizza crusts, and you're like, oh, I'm doing great, I'm no longer consuming gluten. Yet, if you were to do a test like this panel, which evaluates tapioca, and if you were able to quantitatively evaluate and see whether or not you're reacting to tapioca, it may influence you as to what your purchasing decisions are and what foods you consume on a gluten-free diet, and that could help you to dampen the immune system's response. And so I think that this is very valuable. I've seen it again in clinical practice be very helpful, and whether or not that is my experience or other practitioners' experience, I've heard many people gain insight and patients gain benefit from this particular test. So I am in support of this test. I think it's a very valuable panel. This is Array 4 through Cyrex Laboratories. It's the gluten-associated cross-reactive foods and food sensitivity panel. So really, really helpful. And this test looks at IgG antibody and IgA antibodies combined. And these are particular types of immune responses that are not associated with true allergies, but more along the lines of sensitivities. So this looks at gluten-containing and gluten-contaminated products. Like for example, one thing that's very that people have picked up on is coffee, and people talk about coffee being potentially cross-reactive. And the coffee protein itself, to my most recent knowledge and what I've looked up, is not cross-reactive with gluten. So meaning if you're reacting to gluten and you consume coffee beans or coffee in the drink, and you get some of the proteins from the beans, that your immune system will react to it as if it's gluten. And that hasn't been shown in the scientific literature that I'm aware of. What has been shown is that instant coffee is often contaminated with wheat. And when you consume the instant coffee, you can react to the instant coffee because of the wheat contamination, not because of the coffee protein. Though I will say that there are quite a few people that have true allergies to coffee and don't have any idea. They don't know it. So this particular panel does look at instant coffee and to see if you're reacting to instant coffee. It looks at gluten-containing or potentially gluten-contaminated foods, like you could see, for example, very commonly consumed grains like oats, for example. People will go purchase like certified gluten-free oats, and that's great if you're not reacting to oats. But some people actually have immune responses to the proteins in oats, and that can be a problem. The other issue is, for example, things like potatoes. So people will a lot of times substitute potato flour, or as I mentioned earlier, tapioca, or they'll start consuming buckwheat and things like this. And these are gluten-free, containing foods that they assume are safe. And though they do not necessarily contain gluten, you may have sensitivities to those as well. So the overall strategy that I utilize, and that most practitioners that take a functional immunological approach, trying to look at immune triggers and remove them, at least temporarily, to dampen the immune response so that we can work on supporting better immune system, regulatory function, support the optimal health of the GI tract, the microbiome diversity, the intestinal lining integrity and function, all these things that we believe to be helpful for normal immune system function and for dampening the autoimmune process. These are all valuable, removing sensitivities. And this tends to play out clinically. We see this time and time again when we do these different types of tests, that we remove these specific foods, that it can be helpful. So these are, this is a particular lab that I love. I like using their testing. I think it's very valuable. And I wanted to touch on this because this is an important thing to consider when you're looking at a gluten-free diet, because you might be missing this critical piece that that you go gluten-free and then you continue to have some persistent problems. Well, why is that? This is a critical piece of the puzzle that a lot of times is overlooked and just not well understood. So with all this knowledge, the question arises, how do we move forward? And I have some ideas for you. So first of all, if you think you have an issue with gluten, my recommendation would be to get some testing done to see if you can quantifiably identify an immune response to gluten. Okay, that would be the easiest way. Now, you might want to consider doing a gluten elimination or an elimination diet where you remove gluten, but I find that this can be kind of frustrating. I don't want to discourage it, but it can be kind of frustrating because our willpower is not unlimited. We all have a finite amount of willpower. So if let's say you eliminate gluten, you do an elimination diet, just eliminating gluten for 30 days, but you don't really notice, let's say you don't really notice any major differences. Now you definitely could, but let's say you don't, and you're struggling with some kind of health issue, like let's say an autoimmune condition or something like Hashimoto's, and you're hoping that you have an improvement in your health, and you really don't. Well, then you're kind of back to square one, and you're like, okay, I've spent 30 days and I haven't accomplished anything. And this is where I think we have to consider, like, where do you begin? Because what if you were to do like a more comprehensive type of elimination diet that removes gluten and dairy and maybe eggs and potentially soy? What if you started there? Or what if you started with something like a paleo or an autoimmune paleo diet, and you did that for 30 days? That would be a more comprehensive, removing more of the common triggers that we see, dietary triggers that we see, and then you can get a better feel for how your body is maybe reacting to some of the foods that you're commonly consuming. Whereas if you just eliminate gluten, you're going to have wasted, or maybe not wasted, you did learn something, but you will have put in 30 days of effort, and your effort is not without limit. We all have a point where we just throw our hands up. If we try and try and try, we cannot persist because you feel like you're just spinning your wheels. So my thoughts and how I like to approach this is, either consider a more comprehensive elimination diet or get some testing done to get a better idea of what's happening with your immune system and what foods in particular you're reacting to. And I don't want to oversimplify it more than I already have, but this is a general strategy that you might want to consider. Now, in functional medicine, we really try to look at the whole person as much as we can. It's not just about foods. We know that with autoimmunity, and the model that I practice is a detect, remove, repair framework. And it's really a functional immunological approach where you try to detect the triggers. And usually we do blood testing to see if we can identify antibodies against food proteins, pathogens, and chemicals. We also look at the blood and look for antibodies against intestinal and blood-brain barrier proteins to give us an idea of the integrity or lack of integrity of the critical immune system barriers in the GI tract and the blood-brain barrier. Okay, these are important because they help us establish baselines for these critical barrier systems that help to minimize and prevent the movement of food proteins from inside the intestinal tract into the bloodstream that could trigger an immune response and potentially drive the autoimmune process. These are also, that intestinal barrier is also important at keeping bacterial cell wall fragments. In particular, there's some bacteria in your digestive tract that when they die, they break into different fragments, little tiny fragments. And if those are able to pass through the intestinal lining into the bloodstream, they can trigger a really significant, highly inflammatory response. And these things are called lipopolysaccharides, or LPSs. So when we check and assess for the intestinal barrier, the blood-brain barrier proteins, we look to see and get an idea if those are intact or if they're potentially compromised. We take that information in combination with the immune system, the antibody testing against food proteins, against pathogens, and against chemicals, which are three major categories of immune triggers, many of which have been documented in the scientific literature as being triggers and perpetuators of autoimmune responses. It helps us to develop this unique fingerprint for you that we can then use to try and tailor our strategy of removing specific foods, looking in more detail for pathogens, looking for chemicals in your environment. We're looking to remove those and putting together phases of care to try and help us work through the challenges that you're facing with so that we can work towards getting you as healthy as we possibly can. Now, we will often do other tests in addition to that, but that is really a good framework for the functional immunological model, and that's how I would approach it. But you can utilize elimination diets. Just make sure that before you make any changes or do anything that I mentioned here, that you talk to your primary care physician to make sure that it's safe for you. Now, if you need help with anything, you can also reach out to us. I work with people across the United States and around the world via telemedicine, and I'll be happy to try and help you get as healthy as possible. And by addressing the root causes and not just the symptoms, we can really pave the way for true health and well-being. If you found this episode helpful, please share and leave a review. It really helps the podcast. And as always, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. You can also follow us on YouTube and Facebook at the Office of Dr. Brad Shook. You can join our Facebook group, the Greater Hickory Thyroid Support Group, with over 11,000 members, and you can find me on Instagram at Dr. Brad Shook. And remember, together, we can make a difference. As we wrap up today's episode, remember this: health is a journey. It's filled with discoveries and challenges. Every piece of knowledge, every test, every dietary choice is a step towards understanding and healing. So stay curious, stay empowered, and always prioritize your well-being. Until next time, here's to a healthier, happier you. Thanks so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed hanging out behind the scenes with Dr. Shook. You can also talk with and learn from Dr. Shook through Facebook Live on our Facebook page at the Office of Dr. Brad Shook. Don't forget, you can also get access to our videos, guidebooks, and thyroid programs at www.drbradshook.com. Oh yeah, and don't forget one more thing. We can change the world one person, one family, and one community at a time. Until next time, remember, today is your day, and no one will tell you who you are and what you can be.